Hey, thanks for joining me. In this short video, I'm just going to review some of the helpful guidelines for developing messages when conveying bad news. We know that unfortunately in business there comes a time when we do have to relay a piece of negative communication, and so in order for us to maintain positive relationships with our coworkers and with our colleagues and peers, it's important that we can phrase it in such a way it doesn't necessarily change the underlying idea that we're declining or something of that nature, but the manner in which we do it can foster the relationship and allow it to continue as opposed to being just blatantly rude or mean. And so we're going to focus on ultimately how to do that. What I have here are a couple of examples of ways that you could structure such a message. One obviously is better than the other, and I'm sure as you're reading through that you can figure out which one is. And so the top one here, we can just go ahead and read through this briefly. This is a letter that was sent obviously to a particular individual related to a question about installing GPS, of course. So from what it says is we cannot or can't afford to install an in-dash GPS system in our current fleet of company vehicles. I would really like to afford you the luxury of having GPS navigate your trips. Unfortunately, the cost of installing GPS in our current trucks is excessive at over $500 per truck, and then there is a monthly service fee. Management would never agree to spend that much money at this time. I'll do what I can to convince management to include GPS in the specifications of future company vehicles. So there's a couple of things to key in on. You may argue that, you know what, this doesn't sound necessarily bad to me. You know, maybe there are certain things I would change, but as a whole, I might send this type of message. And there are a couple of things that should stand out to you as far as things that maybe you would want to tweak. The first thing is this subject line right here. And you look at it, already says GPS out of the question. And so already you've given the reader no further incentive to actually look at what you've included because they know that you've already declined their request. So really, why would I waste my time? Why would I read further? And as a writer, if you're declining somebody, you generally do not want to give away what it is that you're trying to communicate right off the bat. Now, you might argue, hey, it's more clear, it's more direct, people will appreciate that. And that's true. However, if you're trying to convince somebody or make them understand why it is that you went through a certain course of action, you generally want to start with an inductive approach, meaning that you explain yourself first, you provide the different facts, your analyses, your reasoning for refusing their request, and then after they've had a chance to see your reasoning, maybe it'll make the no a little easier to understand because they may not agree with it at the end of the day. They may think that they still want this and it should be approved, but at least they understand why you chose that certain course of action. And so that does what we call build goodwill, because although we may not always agree on the decisions that we make, we at least understand the thought process that was considered and can understand the rationale. So I would never recommend starting with a subject line that is already declines the request or already hints that the request is going to be declined, because it gives the reader no further incentive to actually open the email or read the document further. It's a complete waste of time. Notice in the first sentence already, they say we can't afford to install an in-dash global positioning system in our current fleet of vehicles. You know, once again, starting with the main idea first, if you're using an inductive approach, if you're trying to send or communicate bad news, you want to start with that information towards the end. You want to start by communicating what it is that your reasoning is to help them understand you. Notice further, it almost comes off a little condescending here too, as I would really like to afford you the luxury of having a GPS navigate your trips. You know, it comes off a little condescending, a little combative in nature, basically saying, you know, this is a luxury, so suck it up, you really don't need this, right? Go ahead and print out a map before you leave and then you're completely fine. So you don't want to take a combative approach. Once again, if I'm reading this, maybe someone might glance over, but if I read this, I'm thinking, you know what, that's not very nice. And once again, I'm just not necessarily going to transition further into the body of this particular message here. So maybe a more effective approach is this second email, which is the same content, it's just worded a different way. And I'll read this through briefly and then we can discuss it. And it starts with the subject line, installation of GPS suggestion. So you notice that it's very neutral. It doesn't lead you to believe that you're refusing the statement or that there's bad news coming. You just know that they're responding to your installation request for a GPS. So first, your suggestion to install an in-dash global positioning system in our current fleet of vehicles was good. So you notice how it starts very positive, right? You're reinforcing the reader. You're thanking them for providing a suggestion, which is great because as an employer, the best suggestions come from the people they directly impact. It isn't your executives thinking of these great ideas in their ivory towers. It is the people that are doing the work that identify there is an opportunity and identify a shortcoming with the current process, and they say, hey, we should do this. So you don't want to discourage them from suggesting further things because that's where you can lack innovation and then you get stale as a company, and it gets very difficult to continue to develop and be innovative if your employees are very fearful of giving suggestions because you completely turn them down and make them feel bad. So moving forward, having GPS systems in our vehicles would be a convenient addition. Once again, you read that sentence and there is nothing to indicate that the person is leaning towards one way or the other. I know that we're agreeing at this point, right? And that's what you want to get the reader to do, is agree with you. Yes, I agree that my suggestion was good. That's not a very far reach. Yes, I agree that it would be convenient. That's why I suggested it. And so you get them agreeing with your rationale. Notice this next paragraph. After checking the price on installing these in our current trucks, I found that it would cost $500 per truck plus a monthly service fee. Once again, nothing as far as opinion goes. This is all fact. I can't dispute this. It does cost $500 per truck. There is a monthly fee. We are still in agreement here. With the current budget situation, these costs would be prohibitive during the current recession. Okay? Unless I've been living under a rock the last few years, I'm well aware that there's a recession going on. I understand how those can imply or can create some budgetary constraints. Obviously, revenues are probably not as high as they could have been. Consumer spending is historically lower. So these are things that I agree with. This is a very rational argument. I'm a reasonable person. I can understand this. Since the idea is an excellent one, we can propose to management that future company vehicles include the GPS. This should be less expensive and costs can be budgeted. Thank you for the excellent idea, and I will pass on to management. So we don't necessarily stop the idea at this point, right? We filter it, we continue to put it up to management, right? Because it is a good idea. And we want to encourage the employee to continue to think of good ideas because those are going to benefit us as a company. But notice what they did very interestingly in paragraph 3, right? They transitioned the argument almost. They developed what we call a counter proposal, which you always want to do. You never want to end on a bad note. Hey, I know it sucks, but sorry, we're not going to approve this, so get over it, blah, blah, blah. And you expect the employee to go on their merry way, being productive and all those different things. Meanwhile, that's going to sit, it's going to resonate with them. It's not going to sit very positively. But instead, they have a counter proposal. It's like, hey, this is a great idea. We would normally love this. Cost is obviously an issue. So this is what we think we can do. Why don't we budget for future vehicles? You think, you know what, maybe I didn't get exactly what I wanted, but still there is some change. The idea is good. They reinforce that. And ultimately, there are going to be some changes going forward with new company vehicles being equipped with GPS. And then once again, a rational argument. This should be less expensive and costs, we can budget for these. Okay? Completely rational arguments here. And so what you do, and they did this perfectly, is they tucked the bad news kind of in the middle, right? You have the good news up here, right? Or not necessarily good news, but neutral arguments. And then once again, you have your counter proposal, more positive news. But you don't have the actual bad news until you get to the second paragraph. So it's tucked away. It's not the first thing I mentioned because I want the reader to continue reading my recommendation or my reasoning. But it's not the last thing because I don't want to necessarily leave a sour taste in their mouth. So I want that counter proposal. I want to say, you know what, I'm declining you, but here's what we can do. And they understand the reasoning and the argument here. Now, one of the things that you also want to do is in the close is you do want to shift the focus away from the bad news. You told them no, there's no reason to pour salt in the wound, there's no reason to rub it in. You want to transition away from that negative news. And they obviously do that by going through the counterproposal and then explaining how this is an excellent idea. It's going to be passed on to management, thanking the individual for their time in developing it. And that's what you can do to help continue and foster the relationship. As I said, our goal here is to make sure that the lines of communication are open, our employees understand our reasoning behind it, right? They understand the why, and ultimately that makes that decision to tell them no a little more understanding. And so try to, if you're ever in a position to which you're communicating potentially negative information, first you want to assess, well, is a letter or email the best way to do it? Maybe it's a face-to-face conversation. But if you decide that ultimately a email or memo of some kind is the best way to do it, make sure that you structure it in a way that encourages the reader to go through and actually see your reasoning, but also reinforces the behavior that you want, and that is that you want them making recommendations, you want them doing things of that nature, you don't want to discourage them. And so follow that format, and that'll ultimately increase the effectiveness of your written communication.